The fire was supposed to take everything: the man, the house, the secrets locked inside. By morning, my uncle was declared dead, and we were already speaking in past tense. But 3 days later, as the organ played and his coffin sat at the front of the church, the doors opened, and Richard Turner walked in. Money doesn't burn. People do. And when there's enough of it on the line, someone's always willing to light the match. I used to think family was different, that blood was thicker than greed. But when I watched my uncle's house turn to ash, I realized I'd been wrong my entire life. The Turner estate sat at the edge of town like a crown on a hill. White stone walls, black slate roof, and manicured gardens stretching toward the wrought iron gates. It wasn't just a house, it was the symbol of everything the Turner family had built over 3 generations: shipping, real estate, banking. And at the center of it all was Richard Turner, my uncle, a man both admired and feared in equal measure. The fire started just after 2 a.m. By the time the first siren pierced the quiet, half the top floor was already an inferno. The night sky glowed orange, ash swirling in the cold air. I stood at the gates, barefoot, my breath steaming as I watched firefighters battle something that didn't want to be beaten. Neighbors huddled together, murmuring. Some cried. Most just stared. I knew Richard was inside. The lights in his study had been on when I drove past earlier that night. He was a creature of habit. A glass of scotch, a cigar, and paperwork until he fell asleep at his desk. When they pulled what was left of him from the ruins just before dawn, they said the fire had taken him quickly. That it was the smoke that killed him, not the flames. I wanted to believe them. I tried to. The official story spread faster than the smoke had: an electrical fault in the wiring above the study. Faulty insulation. An accident. But standing behind the yellow tape later that morning, staring at the scorched ruin of the only room my uncle ever truly lived in, I couldn't shake the thought that the fire had started there for a reason. And that reason had nothing to do with bad wiring. The latch to the study door was twisted but intact, warped from heat, yet the bolt had been thrown from the outside. Locked in. Accidents didn't lock themselves. The days that followed felt less like mourning and more like a boardroom scramble. Richard had no children. He'd never married. His empire was worth hundreds of millions, and the will, last updated 5 years ago, was an object of speculation for every branch of the family tree. Olivia, my cousin, was the loudest voice. Turner Shipping needs a strong, familiar hand, she said during the first family gathering after the fire. We can't risk outsiders taking advantage. Her husband Grant nodded like he'd rehearsed it. Your uncle built his empire with family at the core. It should stay that way. By family, they didn't mean me. 3 days later, the funeral came. The church was old, heavy with incense and candlelight. The Turner crest hung above the altar, a ship under full sail, the family motto etched beneath, Semper Navigare. Always navigating. The coffin was closed. A Turner Shipping flag draped over it, the gold thread catching the light. People filed past to offer condolences to Olivia and Grant, to shake hands with board members, to be seen in the right places. I sat near the back, watching faces instead of listening to the eulogies. Some looked sad. Others looked calculating. And then the doors at the rear creaked open. The murmurs started before I even turned my head. There he was, Richard Turner. The same broad shoulders, the same perfectly combed silver hair. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, a navy tie. His gait was steady, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were alive. A woman in the pew ahead of me gasped loud enough to echo. Someone whispered, "Jesus Christ." I stood without meaning to. Uncle? He didn't look at me. Didn't look at anyone except the coffin. He walked the aisle with the composure of a man inspecting his own tombstone. When he reached the front, he stopped, staring down at the box meant to hold his remains. You could have heard a pin drop. Olivia's face had gone pale, her hand clutching Grant's arm. Grant's jaw tightened. The priest looked like someone had slapped him. Finally, Richard turned to face the crowd. "Well," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, cutting through the stunned silence, "it seems you've been busy in my absence." The silence fractured into gasps, whispers, the scrape of chairs as people shifted to get a better look. I felt the weight of his words hit like a brick to the chest. Because if Richard Turner was standing here, then who had we buried? If this twist has you hooked, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This family's secrets are only beginning to surface, and every revelation will hit harder than the last. If Richard Turner hadn't died in that fire, then someone else had. And if someone else had, then the question wasn't just who it was, but why they'd been in his locked study in the first place. The funeral had ended in chaos. The priest never finished the service. People left in hurried whispers, avoiding eye contact, afraid that even a glance might pull them into whatever storm Richard had just brought with him. I stayed in the pew watching him. He stood at the front of the church, speaking in low tones to Olivia and Grant. Olivia's smile was brittle, her hands clasped too tightly in front of her. Grant looked like he'd bitten into something sour. When Richard finally left, he didn't say a word to me. That night, the Turner estate was once again lit up, this time with cars pulling up the drive and voices carrying out into the cold. Richard had called for a family meeting. By the time I arrived, the air inside was thick with perfume, cigar smoke, and tension. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, the fire behind him casting his shadow across the room. "Well," he began, "it seems some of you were a little too quick to start planning for my absence." No one spoke. He let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then he looked directly at Grant. "You contacted the board the morning after the fire, didn't you? Proposed yourself as interim chairman." Grant shifted in his seat. "We thought you were dead. The company needed stability." "The company," Richard said slowly, "needed the truth." The truth. That was the thing no one here had yet asked for. I finally spoke. "Uncle, if you weren't in that fire, who was?" His eyes slid to mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker there, not fear but calculation. "A man who shouldn't have been in my house," he said, "and whose name doesn't need to be dragged through the mud tonight." It was the kind of answer that shut doors rather than opening them. After the meeting, I lingered by the library door as people filed out. Olivia brushed past me without a glance. Grant muttered something to her under his breath. When they were gone, I stepped into the library. Richard was there, alone, pouring himself a drink. "You could have told me," I said. "Why?" His tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. "So you could do what, Alex? Tell the police? Tell the board?" "I saw the lock," I said. "On your study door. From the outside." He didn't flinch. "Then you know as well as I do that someone in this family wanted me gone." The words sat between us like a live wire. "Was it about the company?" I asked. Richard sipped his drink. "It's always about the company. Or the money that comes with it." I wanted to press him, but he turned away, signaling the conversation was over. The next morning, the papers had a new headline: "Identity of fire victim remains unknown." The medical examiner had confirmed the body wasn't Richard, but they hadn't yet matched it to anyone in the missing persons database. Theories began circulating. A squatter. A burglar. An old business rival. I didn't buy any of them. Later that week, I went to see Detective Mara Hensley, the lead investigator on the fire. We met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the station. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Your uncle's a lucky man," she said. "Or a careful one. Either way, we've got a bigger problem. No one knows who that body belongs to." "Do you think it was murder?" I asked. "I think," she said, stirring her coffee, "that someone wanted that fire to cover something. And until I know who died, I can't tell you what." Back at my apartment, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 words. "Trust no one." No signature. I should have gone to the police. Instead, I went to the only person who might know where it came from. Dana, Richard's longtime assistant. She'd worked for him for 15 years, knew the rhythms of his life better than anyone. She met me at a quiet bar, ordered a gin and tonic, and listened as I told her about the note. "Could be from him," she said finally. "Could be from someone trying to scare you off. In this family, it's hard to tell the difference." "Why wouldn't he just tell me himself?" I asked. "Because you're not the only one he's testing," she said, sipping her drink. The word testing stuck in my head as I drove home. If Richard had staged his death, or at least disappeared long enough for someone to try to profit from it, then maybe this wasn't just about finding out who'd been in that fire. Maybe it was about seeing who would make a move when they thought he was gone. And someone had. I thought about Grant's phone call to the board. Olivia's quick talk of outsiders. My mother's silence through it all. And Richard's careful watch from the head of the table. The only certainty was that the man in the coffin hadn't been Richard Turner. And the only question that mattered now was, whose coffin had it been? If the mystery has you hooked, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The truth about who died in that fire will burn through every lie this family has told. The dead man in my uncle's study had no name, no past, at least not one anyone wanted to talk about. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. He hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd been sent there. Detective Mara Hensley called me 2 days after our coffee meeting. "I've got something," she said, "but it's strange." We met in her office, a cramped space with stacks of case files spilling from the desk. She slid a folder across to me. Inside was a grainy black and white photo of a man, mid-40s, sharp jawline, eyes like he'd been holding his breath for years. "This is who we think was in the study," she said. "Name's Evan Hall. Small-time fixer. Debt collector. Worked the edges of the law." "Worked for who?" I asked. "That's the strange part. His last known employer? Turner Shipping." The name hit like a cold slap. "Was my uncle paying him?" I asked. Hensley shook her head. "Looks more like the other way around. Hall's bank account was bled dry over the last 6 months. All withdrawals, no deposits. If I didn't know better, I'd say he owed someone a lot of money." "And you think he came to my uncle's house to, what?" "Collect. Or deliver a message," she said. "But I can't figure out why he'd be locked inside when the fire started." Back at my apartment, I spread the folder's contents across the coffee table. Hall had a record: minor assault, loan sharking, fraud. Nothing that screamed murder target. But in the margins of one police report, a note caught my eye: contact at T.S. R. Turner. If my uncle had known this man, why pretend otherwise? And why was no one in the family mentioning him? I decided to start with Dana. She'd been tight-lipped before, but the connection to Turner Shipping might loosen her up. She met me at the same bar, same table. I slid the photo across to her. "Do you know him?" I asked. She didn't touch the picture. "Yes." "Why was he in the house the night of the fire?" Her eyes flicked toward the bartender, then back to me. "Richard owed him something. Or maybe it was the other way around. I never knew for sure." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you without ending up in the same place he did," she said, pushing the photo back toward me. Her refusal only made me more certain she knew exactly what had happened. I decided to bypass her entirely. Richard kept most of his old company files in a secure storage unit downtown. I still had a key from when I helped him move things years ago. The place smelled of dust and old paper. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, each labeled with meticulous handwriting. I found the box marked Contracts 2015 to 2020 and started sifting through. Near the bottom, I found a thin red folder labeled Hall. Inside were 3 documents. A non-disclosure agreement with Turner Shipping, signed by Hall. A promissory note: Hall owed Turner $250,000, payable within 6 months. A termination letter, dated 2 weeks before the fire. The pieces clicked together in my mind. Hall owed my uncle $250,000. He couldn't pay. And 2 weeks later, he was dead in my uncle's study. But there was still one problem: Richard was alive. If he'd wanted Hall dead, why fake his own death too? Unless the fire had been meant for both of them. When I got back to my car, there was another envelope on the windshield. Inside, a single Polaroid. Me standing in the storage unit holding the red folder. Written in black marker across the bottom: "You're not as invisible as you think." The next morning, I confronted Richard. I found him in the study of his temporary townhouse, papers spread across the desk like nothing had happened. "Evan Hall," I said. "Why was he in your house?" Richard didn't look up. "Old debt. I told him to come by so we could settle it." "And you locked him in?" "I didn't lock him in," he said, his voice hardening. "But someone did. And if I had to guess, they thought I'd be the one in there." "Who?" I pressed. He finally looked at me. "You really think I'm going to tell you that when I'm not even sure whose side you're on?" It was the first time he'd accused me outright of being part of the problem. I left without another word, but the idea stuck with me. If Richard didn't trust me, maybe that was because he'd already decided everyone in this family had something to gain from his death, including me. That night, I got a call from Detective Hensley. "We found something in Hall's apartment," she said. "A burner phone. Only 2 numbers in it, your uncle's and Grant Turner's." The line went quiet for a moment as the weight of the connection settled between us. "Looks like your cousin's husband might be more involved than we thought," Hensley said. I hung up without promising her anything, but inside, the decision had already been made. If Grant Turner had set that fire, I was going to prove it, even if it meant burning every last bridge in the family to the ground. If you need to know how deep this family's treachery runs, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next move in this investigation will put Alex directly in the crosshairs. Grant Turner had the smile of a man who thought he'd already won. And that was the problem: people who think they've won never see the punch coming. I didn't tell Detective Hensley that I was going to speak to Grant. She would have tried to stop me, called it interfering with an active investigation. But this wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was personal. Grant and Olivia lived in a glass and steel condo downtown, the kind that screamed new money, despite the fact that every dollar came from my uncle's empire. When Olivia let me in, her expression was polite but tight, as if she'd been warned about me. Grant was in the living room, lounging in a leather armchair with a tumbler of whiskey. He didn't stand. "Alex," he said, his tone dripping with casual disdain. "What brings you here? Need a loan?" I didn't bother sitting. I pulled the photo of Evan Hall from my pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table. Grant's smirk faltered for half a second before returning. "Who's that supposed to be? Don't play dumb. He died in my uncle's study. And we both know your number was in his phone." Grant swirled his drink. The police must be desperate if they're handing evidence over to you. This isn't a game, Grant. Did you set that fire? His eyes narrowed just enough to betray that I'd struck something. But instead of answering, he leaned back and took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Careful, Alex," he said. "Accusations like that can get you in trouble." Olivia returned with a tray of coffee, setting it between us. "What's going on?" she asked, looking between us. "Your husband's been talking to the man who died in the fire," I said. "Maybe you should ask him why." Olivia froze, her eyes darting to Grant. Grant gave a low chuckle. "Alex here thinks I'm some kind of arsonist. Isn't that right?" I didn't answer. I just let the silence sit, thick and heavy. Finally, Olivia set her cup down. "Grant, business," he said curtly. "Evan Hall owed me money. I met with him a few times. That's it. And you didn't think to mention that after the fire?" I asked. "I didn't think it was relevant," he replied, "because I didn't kill him. And if you keep poking around, you might find yourself in a position you can't walk back from." The threat hung in the air. I'd heard veiled warnings before, but this one felt different, heavier. I stood. "If you had nothing to do with the fire, then you've got nothing to worry about." As I reached the door, Grant's voice followed me. "Be careful where you point your matches, Alex. Fires have a way of coming back to you." I didn't go home. I went to Richard. He was in his townhouse study again, but this time he was on the phone. He ended the call when he saw me. "Grant knew Hall," I said. His number was in Hall's phone. He admitted it. Richard didn't look surprised. "Of course he did. You knew." "I suspected," he said. "That's why I didn't die in that fire." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Do you know why chess masters are so hard to beat? It's not because they make better moves. It's because they already know which moves you will make." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said, "that if you want to survive this, you need to start thinking like your enemies. And maybe, just maybe, stop assuming I'm one of them." I didn't know whether to believe him. "Why not tell the police?" I asked. "Because the person who locked Hall in that study wasn't working alone. And until I know exactly who else is involved, I'm not giving anyone the satisfaction of knowing what I know." Before I could press him, his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen, then turned it face down. "Go home, Alex," he said. "Stay out of sight for a few days." Something in his tone told me that wasn't a suggestion. When I left, I caught sight of a black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't there when I arrived. The windows were tinted, but I could feel eyes on me. As I started my car, the SUV pulled away, merging into traffic without signaling. Back at my apartment, another envelope waited under my door. This one held no note, just a single item, a house key. I recognized it immediately. It was from the old Turner Lake house, sold years ago. On the back, scratched into the metal, were 3 letters, MOT. Moment of truth. I didn't sleep that night. Because in my gut, I knew this wasn't over, it was just about to turn. And whoever had left that key wanted me to open more than just a door. If you've been following this trail of lies and threats, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next move will take Alex to the lake house, and what he finds there will set the final trap in motion. The Turner Lake house had been empty for years, but the smell inside wasn't dust and pine, it was fresh paint and lies. And somewhere in those walls was the reason a man burned to death in my uncle's study. The lake was black glass under a moonless sky. My headlights swept over the winding driveway, picking out the sagging boathouse and the outline of the lake house itself. Richard had sold the property years ago, but the key in my pocket told a different story. When I reached the front door, the lock turned easily. Inside, the air was cool, dry, and raw. The place didn't look abandoned. The hardwood floors had been swept. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. In the living room, a blanket was folded neatly over the couch, too neatly for a house no one lived in. I moved room to room, listening. No creaks, no hum of an old fridge, just stillness. Upstairs, the master bedroom was bare except for a desk and a single lamp. On the desk was a manila folder, My name was written on it. Inside were photographs. Some were surveillance shots. Me outside the Turner estate after the fire, meeting Detective Hensley for coffee, walking into Richard's townhouse. Others were older. Me at my father's funeral, at college graduation, even playing catch with my uncle in the backyard when I was 12. Under the photos was a single page typed in bold. The weak link. I heard the floorboard creak behind me. I spun, but the voice came first. You weren't supposed to find this until it was over. Grant stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. You left the key, I said. He smiled faintly. Of course I did. You're predictable, Alex. Always chasing answers instead of realizing you're the answer. What's that supposed to mean? It means Richard's been testing us all, he said. Seeing who's loyal, who's ambitious. But the truth is he's lost his edge. And men like that don't deserve to keep the crown. I took a step toward him. So you set the fire. I paid Hall to deal with Richard, he said, shrugging. But the old man got lucky. Slipped out before the flames took him. Hall didn't. And you locked him in? His smirk deepened. Let's just say I didn't give him much of a choice. The rage boiled in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. Why kill him? Why not just take over the company after he retired? Because he never would have retired, Grant said. You know that. And because when you inherit something by force, people don't question your right to it. They fear it. I glanced at the desk. The folder was still open. And me? Where do I fit in? Grant's eyes gleamed. Collateral. I needed someone to take the fall if the police started asking the wrong questions. You were perfect, too curious for your own good, not enough power to fight back. The moment stretched between us, both of us knowing only one of us was leaving the lake house alive. Then, from downstairs came the creak of another step. Grant's head snapped toward the sound. Richard's voice carried up the staircase. You always talk too much, Grant. The next moments were chaos. Richard appearing in the doorway, Grant swinging the gun toward him, me lunging forward. The shot went wide, shattering the lamp. We crashed into the desk, the folder scattering across the floor. The gun slid under the bed. Richard moved faster than I'd ever seen, grabbing Grant by the collar and slamming him against the wall. You think you can take what's mine? Richard snarled. Grant spat blood. It's already mine. You just don't know it yet. The struggle was brutal and short. Richard drove his fist into Grant's temple, and when he staggered, I grabbed the nearest thing, the heavy lamp base, and swung. Grant crumpled, motionless. For a long moment, the only sound was my own breathing. Richard straightened, his eyes on me. You didn't have to do that. He would have killed you, I said. Richard studied me for a long time, then nodded. Maybe. We dragged Grant to the boathouse. Richard opened the sliding door to reveal a small motorboat already idling in the water. He won't be found, Richard said, his voice flat. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. When we were done, we returned to the lake house. Richard gathered the photos and folder from the bedroom, stuffing them into a leather satchel. You were never the weak link, Alex, he said quietly. That was just to see how far you'd go to prove otherwise. I wanted to ask what that meant, but when I looked at him, I knew I wouldn't get a straight answer. Outside, the night was calm, the lake smooth again. But I knew the surface never told the whole story, not with water, not with family, and certainly not with Richard Turner. If you've been following Alex to the edge of the truth, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The final chapter will reveal who really wins when the fire dies out. I thought I understood what survival meant. But in the Turner family, survival isn't just living through the fire. It's learning how to hold the match without burning your own hand. The morning after the lake house, I woke in my apartment to the low hum of city traffic and a text from Richard. It's done. Stay quiet. No explanation. No request for help disposing of Grant's body. Just 2 words that closed the book on last night as if it were a chapter he'd written months ago. The news broke by noon. Turner Shipping COO missing, presumed dead. A grainy photo of Grant, cropped from a charity gala shot, stared back from every news site. According to the articles, he'd gone missing during a solo trip, and police were concerned for his safety. No mention of me. No mention of the lake house. Olivia released a statement thanking the public for their concern and asking for privacy. I read it twice, wondering if she knew the truth, or if she was smart enough not to ask. I didn't hear from Richard for 3 days. When he finally called, it was to summon me to the townhouse. He was in the study, pouring a drink, the satchel from the lake house on the desk. You handled yourself well, he said. I didn't have much choice, I replied. There's always a choice, he said, handing me a glass. You just made the one that kept you alive. I sipped the scotch, letting the burn settle in my chest. What happens now? Grant's gone. Olivia will resign from the board to focus on family. I'll reassume my position as chairman. And you, he paused, his eyes meeting mine. You'll take a seat at the table. It took a second for the words to register. You're putting me on the board? I need someone I can trust, he said. I almost laughed. You don't trust anyone. That's true, he admitted. But I trust your instincts, because they're mine. I set the glass down. This was all a test, wasn't it? The fire. The funeral. All of it. Richard didn't deny it. I needed to know who in this family would betray me the moment they thought I was gone, he said. And I needed to see if you had the stomach to do what had to be done. And if I hadn't? You wouldn't be standing here, he said simply. We were silent for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me since the fire. Why me? He smiled faintly. Because you're your father's son. And your father was the only one who never tried to take what was mine. He understood that loyalty has value. That night, I walked home through streets slick with rain, thinking about what he'd said. It was true, my father had been loyal to Richard until the day he died. But loyalty, I was starting to understand, wasn't a virtue in the Turner family. It was a currency. Weeks passed. The police investigation into Grant's disappearance stalled. Turner shipping stock rebounded under Richard's triumphant return. The fire victim, Evan Hall, faded from the news entirely, another unsolved mystery the city would forget. Dana still worked for Richard, but now she called me directly when he needed something. She never mentioned the lake house, and neither did I. One evening, I found another envelope under my apartment door. Inside was a single photograph, me seated at the Turner boardroom table, Richard beside me. On the back, in neat block letters, "Welcome to the family business." The next board meeting was a performance. Richard at the head, me to his right, the rest of the directors in their tailored armor. We discussed shipping contracts, overseas expansions, quarterly earnings. Not a word about fires, funerals, or missing executives. But when the meeting ended, Richard leaned toward me and murmured, "One day, Alex, this will all be yours." I didn't know if it was a promise or a warning. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat in the dark, the city lights flickering beyond the window. I thought about Grant's smirk in the lake house, about the weight of the lamp in my hand, about the sound it made when it connected. I thought about the key Richard had left me, the one that led me exactly where he wanted me to go. I realized then that the Turner family wasn't about blood. It was about control. And maybe, just maybe, Richard had been right. Survival here meant knowing when to hold the match. When I went to bed, I left the lights on. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I'd learned something in the fire. It's easier to see the shadows when they can't hide in the night. And that's the story of how a house fire lit the fuse on a family empire, and how the man who was supposed to be buried ended up pulling the strings from the shadows. But in the Turner family, nothing stays buried forever. Not the past, not the truth, and certainly not the people willing to kill for it. If you enjoyed this twisted journey through greed, betrayal, and cold-blooded survival, hit that like button to let me know and drop a comment with your theory. Was Richard grooming Alex as an heir, or as his next pawn?